Hi everyone, I'm going to get started. I hope that everybody is doing well today. If you're watching live, happy Friday. Welcome, ready for the weekend. My name is Katie Jacobs. I work with HR leaders at the CIPD and I've been hosting our coronavirus webinar series. And this afternoon, we're going to be exploring the impact COVID-19 is having on the labour market. We're going to hear about the results of the CIPD and Adecco Group's latest labour market outlook. And we're going to get some practitioner insight into what a recruitment evolution could look like. Joining me are speakers, Gerwin Davis, Senior Labour Market Analyst at CIPD, Alex Fleming, Country Head and President of Staffing and Solutions at the Adecco Group UK and Ireland, and Toby Culshaw, Global Head of Talent Intelligence and Executive Recruitment Research at Philips. Thank you so much everyone for joining us this afternoon. As ever, I'm just going to run through our housekeeping notes. The session is being recorded. It will be available on demand this afternoon. You'll find it on the webinar section of the CIPD website. You'll also be able to download the slides there, and you can access recordings of all of our previous webinars there, as well as sign up for future sessions. Just a reminder that next week we won't be doing any webinars because it's the CIPD Festival of Work, and we hope to see many of you online there. If you would like to submit any questions today, and please do because these things are often only as good as the interaction we get, then could I ask you to use the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A tab rather than the chat box. A reminder that for legal advice, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7 and you will get an individual response. And as ever, I'm just flagging up our wellbeing helpline for the members in UK and Ireland. With award-winning workplace wellbeing provider, Health Assured, we're now providing CIPD members with free health and wellbeing support via sessions with qualified therapists. And as ever, a reminder to keep an eye on the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for up-to-date information and resources about all things coronavirus. So onto the topic this afternoon. The coronavirus pandemic and the resulting economic crisis have had a significant impact on the labour market. Most businesses have had to make major changes to their practice as a result. So what does the future look like for the labour market and for recruitment practice? The latest edition of the CIPD and Adecco Group Labour Market Outlook presents a pretty timely picture of the labour market in the UK and Ireland, capturing employer intentions around recruitment, redundancy and pay intentions during lockdown. It was done shortly after the announcement of the furlough scheme, so it reflects that. So how this is going to work today, first of all, Gerwin and then Alex are going to take us through the findings, and they're going to talk a little bit about their predictions for how we'll see the labour market shift in the coming months. And then Toby's going to join us for a panel discussion to give some practitioner insight. So please do get your questions in, and thank you for those who sent some in advance as well. So that's it from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Gerwin, who's going to take us through some of the data. A reminder, Gerwin, that you need to unmute yourself, so I have to say now every session.
Thank you, Katie. Well, moving on to the first slide, I think the first thing to say is that, as Harold Macmillan once said, the UK has never had it so good, and that's certainly applied to the UK labour market. If you look at all of the employment indicators, whether that be the employment rate, unemployment rate, and especially in terms of female participation rate and the disability gap, all reached record highs or lows. And as a result, we've started this crisis from a very, very high base. The other thing to mention is that employment growth that we've seen over the last few years has been dominated by full-time, permanent and skilled roles. So this narrative that employment growth has been driven by insecure casual work is actually couldn't be further from the truth. However, as we know, the last few months have seen the labour market take a significant turn for the worse, and that's reflected in our labour market outlook survey data, which is seen. Turn to the next slide, please, and that will show. You see the figure 0. Anything above that broadly indicates that employment levels look set to increase over the 3 months to July this year, and you'll see a very sharp fall. And unsurprisingly, it's the private sector that's bore the brunt of that, although we're seeing the voluntary sector suffer too. and by comparison and by contrast, public sector has held up fairly well and actually seen employment levels increase. And moving on to the next slide, in terms of the subsectors, you'll see that the public sector is dominating that employment growth, especially in healthcare, which includes social care employers who will be recruiting not least to cover absence, and to a lesser extent public administration, which covers local government and public sector. We know that they've had resourcing challenges and have needed to take on more staff to deal with this crisis. There's a big slide in scale, some big variations, but unsurprisingly, you'll see that the labour-intensive sectors, especially the likes of hospitality and retail, are the ones that have been affected most, and where we are seeing the biggest employment contraction in terms of sectors. Moving on to the next slide, what's been interesting is the dynamic between recruitment and redundancies, and it's fair to say that perhaps recruitment has taken more of a hit than redundancies, and there are two obvious explanations for that, which I'll come to. But in starting with recruitment, we've seen hiring intentions fall sharply, but that's not universal. Not only is there variation between public and voluntary and private sector, but we are seeing pockets of the private sector take on more staff as well. So distribution, parts of the retail sector, for instance, we're seeing some growth. The other point to mention here is I think we saw a real shock at the end of March, first half of April, where hiring almost fell to a standstill, and we're gradually seeing that start to pick up according to real-time data. So if you look at the ONS data, which suggested that vacancies fell by 170,000 to 637,000, that's a steep fall. We might not see such steep falls in the next few months, especially as the economy starts to recover and we start to see restrictions ease and some economic activity return. As I've said, the redundancy activity is much lower than it would have been. Job retention scheme has affected 6 million employees in the second quarter, according to various estimates. And our own survey data suggests that around a third of those who have been furloughed would have been made redundant. So it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that that equals 2 million jobs, which could clearly unwind as the scheme progresses and as employer input into, by way of financial contribution increases as we progress throughout the year. But I think what's gone underreported is what employers have done. They've employed a variety of tactics around pay freezes, recruitment freezes, redeployment, as well as a reduction in hours, as well as some of the wider conversations they've had about sabbaticals and things like that, which I think have also helped avoid redundancies in some cases. But it does seem, despite that, that employment will increase sharply as we progress throughout the year. We've seen some eye-watering figures banded around. It's also unquestionable that youth unemployment will be a particular issue, given that we've got, 600 to 800,000 job seekers leaving university and school this summer. With hiring at relatively low levels, it's inevitable that many of those will become part of the claimant count. And of course, then we've got this relative cliff edge on the horizon on the 31st of October when the scheme finishes. But that's not to say that we shouldn't overlook what's going to happen between now and then, where employer contributions are going to increase to 10% of wages, to 20% of wages, and ultimately the scheme will end. So we could see a second wave or a surge in redundancies at that point. Now, the obvious corollary of that is that we will see the labour and skill shortages that have dominated the narrative over the last few years ease substantially, which will ease some pressure on wages, especially for those who are looking to recruit for shortage occupations. And in terms of the next slide, looking at wages, that's reflected in this forward-looking indicator. We ask what employers' future intentions are for the next 12 months. and you'll see that median and basic pay expectations have gone down to 1%, but in the private sector, it's 0. There's just one thing to point out with that. Clearly, many employers will be communicating with the staff about the obvious reasons for that. But it's worth also pointing out that in real terms, this may not feel like a fall in living standards, in that we expect inflation to fall in line with that. But they will still feel worse off nonetheless as a result of that, because we know that they have benefited in the last couple of years as wages have outstripped inflation. So it will still feel somewhat painful, but some consolation from the fall in inflation. And in terms of the last slide, because it's very difficult to look for solutions when economic activity has fallen as sharply as it has, but some thoughts around some of the issues that are likely to occur over the next few months are that the winding down of the furlough scheme will undoubtedly lead to a rise in wage costs. One of the things that we've seen over the last few years is this lack of interest in apprenticeships, despite the apprenticeship levy, despite the fact that perhaps the national living wage is increasing, continues to increase at a fast rate, and apprenticeship wage rates are much lower. And of course, we've got this issue around youth unemployment as well. So that could be a really good vehicle, I think, for organisations, if they're not considering them already, to either introduce new apprenticeship programmes or new ones. We know from the IFS research, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that working mums are 1.5 times more likely to leave or quit their jobs during COVID-19. So I think there's an obvious risk there if and when redundancies occur, that perhaps those, especially those on furlough, may be more at risk than others of being made redundant. And we just need to ensure that those who are not undecided and out of mind are being sort of unfairly treated in any redundancy activity. And then the final bullet is around flexible working. We're seeing a lot of discussion about the success of home working as an experiment. Very few reports of negative impact on productivity, although perhaps in the initial phase there was, because technology was an issue for many. What we're not hearing is any relatively little discussion, rather, about flexible working. So the wide range of arrangements that could include part-time working, term-time working, job sharing, career breaks, all of which have had very little uptake according to official data. Now could be a really good time to have that discussion with your employees, for your benefit in terms of wage costs, but above all, for employee engagement. This is has been a time for reflection for many employees who might wish to change their working arrangements. And unfortunately, the flexible working arrangements have been too heavily dominated by annualized hours and flexi time, and there are other avenues open which are seemingly being ignored. So this could be a good time to review that. We look set to switch from passive labour market government policy through the job retention scheme through a more active one. That could be a job guarantee for young people or long-term unemployed. We've heard more recently that perhaps there might be some apprenticeship guarantee. Big question, of course, with that is whether it's publicly funded. Now, if it's a job guarantee, my bets are that it would be publicly funded in line with the youth jobs guarantee from the last recession. Perhaps more questionable with the apprenticeship one. So we'll be doing our best in our discussions with the government to get answers, but also obviously give employers as much financial support as they can with that. And that will be supported by, I think, ultimately a lot more government spending, perhaps an acceleration of the existing infrastructure projects that they've got in line, such as HS2 and some of the other transport projects, along with sort of green technology and energy projects. And just lastly, it's understandable that this has gone under the radar, but we are now 6 months away from the introduction of migration restrictions, which will be the biggest change that we've seen in immigration policy in the UK. And I think, as we saw in the initial slide, the UK labour market has shown itself to be a really good generator of jobs. There's no reason why, if in the scenario of a V-shaped recovery, that we could see employment bounce back really quickly and start to see some of those labour skill shortages re-emerge. And of course, this is a particular risk for low-wage employers, so employers of low-skilled labour, because we know that there is no low-skilled or unskilled route for those employers. So now might be, notwithstanding the bandwidth, I think the limited bandwidth that organisations have got, now might be a really good time to think about how you plan to cope with not just the next 6 months, but the next 18 months when, and hopefully if and when the economy recovers somewhere close to normality, and how you actually fill those positions, because many of those have historically been filled by non-UK nationals. And there's some big questions as to whether you can do it through automation and technology or redeployment, or whether you have to do an awful lot more to encourage a lot more job seekers who have traditionally ignored some of those roles. So over to you now, Alex.
Thanks, Goin. Some really interesting thoughts there, definitely. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining the webinar today. So thank you to the CIPD for inviting me. I've been working for the Adecco group now for 20 plus years, and I've done most roles in this business at some point or another. And I think it's safe to say, though, that I haven't experienced anything quite like the past few months in my career to date. It certainly has been a significant learning for us all and tested our resilience. It certainly tested mine. Can we just move on the slide? Thank you. I'm going to cover off a few points today, how we as a group have dealt with the impact of COVID-19, my take on the labour market outlook report that we've just discussed, and how I see the future of work in the short and longer term. Can we move the slide, please? Thank you. Firstly, in terms of the group's response to COVID-19, with the Adecco group being a global organisation, and with the UK and Ireland being a little bit behind the other countries, our global and European colleagues were able actually to offer us a lot of invaluable insight and support in how to deal with the crisis in the early phases. And this included sharings around dealing with the changing client and candidate needs, orientating virtual working, of course, advising on government policies, deploying teams, and identifying new tech solutions. And many new transferable skills have been developed, that's for sure, and are continuing to be developed. As a business, we've had to be extremely agile, and we've learned very quickly that the speed of our internal change was very much dependent on what was happening externally. And regrettably, as Goin was talking about earlier, like many other businesses, we've unfortunately had to furlough some colleagues ourselves. And this has been a very hard step for us and for everyone to take. But personally, I can't commend our colleagues enough, because I think they've dealt with the situation with real true professionalism, and they do understand that in most cases it is a short-term measure. We've divided the recovery into 4 phases. So react, prepare, bounce back, and then reimagine. And we're now firmly into that bounce back and reimagine phase in terms of our planning. But what I would say is that dialing up the communication has been absolutely key during a time like this. As not only are we experiencing huge amounts of change, we're also getting used to working remotely. And it is an uncertain time for everyone, of course, and there has been a lot of upheaval in colleagues' personal and professional lives. So it's critical that our workforce is kept informed and that it's consistent and concise. And I really do believe in a transparent communication methodology with colleagues. Of course, it needs to be positive and encouraging with that messaging, but also at the same time, I don't believe in sugarcoating the situation. I think being honest at this time in particular is really critical, so people really know where they stand. And it's also important that I think they hear the messages directly from me and from the leadership team, particularly the more challenging messages. So we've been carrying out fortnightly pulse check surveys with all of our colleagues, and these have helped us to better understand what the real needs are of the business and help us know how to support the teams better. And in fact, the feedback is telling us every time that we can't actually communicate enough right now. They want more, and that more is better. I think keeping teams upbeat and motivated has never been more important as well. And morale is key to productivity and ultimately retention post-pandemic. And we recently did some research that found that nearly 1 in 5 employees said that the company they work for, or that they did work for before being furloughed, is not treating its workforce well during the pandemic. And this is particularly true of younger workers. So nearly a quarter of those aged between 18 and 24 years did not feel their employer was treating their staff well during the crisis, in comparison to just 13% of those aged 35 to 44 years old who said the same. And I think it really does show that how you treat people in times of crisis is what really matters. And we have and still are prioritising making sure that our employees are supported during this time, whether that's encouraging mental and physical well-being or creating that sense of virtual community. And I think understanding what is required to get the best from your people has never been more critical. If we can move the slide, thank you. The Spring LMO presents an honest and very timely reflection, I think, of the labour market when the data was collected. And we were only 1 week into the UK's lockdown period at that time. And since then, I think the labour market has undergone a significant transformation. Remote working has been adopted by a vast number of organisations, and employers have been doing all that they can to stave off redundancies, as Gerwin was saying earlier, including embracing home working, freezing hiring, introducing these flexible working arrangements. And the report highlights the importance of the job retention scheme, which has truly been a life raft for the labour market over these past few months, with recent figures stating that more than a quarter of the UK's workforce is currently on furlough. If we can move the slide, thank you. So I think the reality is the labour market will never go back to what it was pre-COVID-19, and we are and will continue to see change as organisations continue to evolve and adapt to the new normal, or as I'm calling it, the better normal. And no one can be 100% sure of exactly what's to come. So we can only really make assumptions based on the current facts. And I personally think a lot of this is based on as and when there is a vaccination. In the short term, safely returning to work is our priority, and a change in working arrangements is likely to be our first transformation. Recent events have shown that a solid
Just lost you there, Alex.
Company and technology will. Oh, you lost me. Am I back?
If you just go back 10 seconds. I think you said recent events have shown us. That was the last.
Okay, no problem. It's saying my internet connection's a bit unstable, so apologies. Recent events have shown us that a solid company infrastructure can withstand these unprecedented circumstances. So I think it is highly likely that working from home will remain a continued measure for workforces. And I think technology will allow us to work effectively at a distance. We've seen that with telemedicine, we've seen that with online education. And some of our clients who have changed to a virtual hiring model have now told us that they will never return to the old way. The pandemic has also shown that teams can work effectively when they're not under one roof together. And in 2019, only 30% of UK employees had experienced working from home, according to the ONS. And now an enormous number of employers and employees are doing so. At the Adecco group now, for example, more than 80% of our global 35,000 colleagues are working remotely. And as a result, employees have utilised the opportunity to shape their working days in a way that suits them better. So the need for that flexible working and a strong work-life balance, I think, will remain in very high demand. I also think strong leadership is really necessary to remote teams during change, and particularly when you are working remotely. And there are some colleagues who are keen to really throw themselves into that new normal and use it as an opportunity to reskill and upskill. But equally, there are those that are more resistant, who don't like the change, don't see the benefit of it. And after all, you know, we have moved this digital revolution that would have probably taken up to 10 years to get to where we are. We've actually done that in a period of roughly 3 months. So it is not a surprise. There's no denying, though, that it is a really tough market right now, and overall hiring is down. And we've recently seen hiring restart slowly and incrementally in some industries. So we've seen slight recoveries in insurance, construction, property and utilities. And some industries, as Gerwin was saying, are holding up well: healthcare, e-commerce, finance. And of course, as the economy strengthens further, we will start to, and the restrictions ease, we will start to see this further improve. And job roles where we're really seeing a rise in demand are things like product management, machine learning, data science, business transformation, some supply chain, and also in customer service. I think one key thing we can be sure of in terms of the future is that new jobs will arise, and this will be changes in consumer lifestyle, and the pandemic likely to bring permanent upgrades to the way in which people work. So, for example, according to a global survey by EY, 41% of the 2,900 executives surveyed are planning to ramp up investments in automation once coronavirus passes. And as a group, we have had to implement virtual learning, as I mentioned earlier, as a result of COVID-19. And this virtual hiring through the use of video interviewing software mainly, and it's shown to be really, really effective. And it's likely that we will implement more and more virtual processes where necessary. But I do still think that face-to-face interactions will still have value when building relationships with clients and candidates, but there is a definitive incentive for people to automate. You just can move the slide on, please. Research from McKinsey at the start of the year found that 87% of executives said they were experiencing skill gaps in the workforce or expected them within a few years. And now that the impact of COVID-19 has made this even more urgent than ever. And whilst PwC also reported that 74% of the workforce are ready to learn new skills or retrain to remain employable in the future. And there has definitely been an uptake in online self-learning since lockdown started. We can move on. And I really do believe it's the people with these imaginal skills and creativity who will help us to accelerate out of this. And those skills will be in demand like never before. Lockdown, I think, has also given people the chance to reflect on their careers and really think through whether they want to be doing something different in the future. You can move the slide. Our recent research on job seeking post-pandemic found that more 18 to 24-year-olds than older workers are considering a career change. However, it was found that a quarter of those aged between 45 and 54 years are considering a change in role post the pandemic. So unfortunately, as the LMO finds, cost-cutting measures include not investing in L&D training. And in my view, this is a big mistake. Yes, it will help alleviate costs today, but it won't equip the business with the skill set it desperately needs for the future. And in addition to this, all the research points to the fact that employees today expect this investment from an employer. And it's the executives who actively champion learning and give it a seat at the boardroom table who will attract and retain the very best talent. New slide, please. Longer term, the need for spacious physical workplaces, I think, will diminish in its importance, and people will work remotely more. Technology will evolve to suit our future needs. And our workforces will be more agile and more flexible as a result of the changes, which is only a positive. Remote workforces rely on trust to really maximize productivity. I think this is a really important point, because trust has to be deeply embedded in the organizational culture for managers to get the best out of their teams, but also for employees to have the freedom to work effectively and work autonomously. There will, however, be the continual need for social contact, and this comes, I think, from a physical workspace, and it helps in forming and building relationships, which is key to successful business. So technology, I think, will boom as it plays a critical role in the new world of work, and it's necessary in accommodating new working arrangements. But also, the impact of automation on the labour market will accelerate as a result of the pandemic. And it's hard to deny that the benefits of automation in a world post-pandemic, because it requires no social distancing and it improves efficiency in lots of instances. So finally, business leaders will need to define the goals that align with the changes and ensure a culture of positivity, trust, and inclusivity. And interestingly, the key skills needed by leaders to prepare for the future are the soft skills: resilience, flexibility, agility, creativity. And we have been talking about the importance of these skills for a while now. And I think now more than ever, it is clear that they're the key to unlocking the future of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Sorry that we lost you there for a minute, but I think we got all the content and that was really, really great, really interesting. Before I move on to a kind of panel discussion, I'm just going to put a few questions to Toby. So Toby, maybe first of all, could you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and your role, and Philip's, and then maybe some reflections on what you've just heard from Gowan and Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. So my role, I lead global talent intelligence and executive recruitment research for Philips. So that means essentially looking at the external labour market from a data perspective to help inform our business decisions better. Philips, global technology company, most people know our name from things like the light bulbs. We don't do lighting anymore. We've moved away from the lighting organisation quite a few years ago. We don't make TVs anymore. We don't do audio. We are very much nowadays gearing towards a health tech company, and we've been pivoting for probably about 5 years and moving much more into that health technology space. And the joys and challenges that come with that in terms of that transformation. In terms of the reflections, I think there was some really, really good stuff in there. I think some really good stuff. I was, I kept making notes as we were going. But I think there's some really important lessons coming out. I think Alex's point right at the end around trust is probably one of the most important there. I think with this remote working environment and the remote working culture, trust is absolutely paramount. I think we'll see a lot of technology come into play around micromanagement and understanding what people are doing through their workday. That isn't what people need to feel trusted in a workforce. So I think we need to be really careful as leadership teams around what do we actually engage and what are we using that technology for from a trust perspective. But yeah, I think absolutely agree with everything that was said. I think there's some real risks associated with the transformation going on. So the potential psychological burnout from the remote working, the increasing video interviewing, etc. But yeah, in terms of the labour market and the skill shortages, we can obviously discuss it in more detail in a second, but I think there's going to be some real challenges ahead in terms of how things are moving and what that could mean for employers.
And for your organisation, how has it kind of shifted your recruitment strategy during this crisis? What's changed? Yeah,
so in the short term, it's meant very much a refocus on what we need in the short to medium term. So we've been very much looking at where we need to invest our resources, essentially to help the ventilator side of our business. So we do a lot of work around ventilators, and obviously that's key for COVID, wanting to ramp up that business to help as many people as we can. So we've had to have a real focus on that, whether it's from a pure TA perspective and focus of resource, whether that's been redeploying people internally, using flex resourcing and flexible models, looking very much at a total workforce picture. So rather than just focusing on the permanent headcount piece, thinking about the bigger picture, what's the context of what we're looking at and what is the appropriate workforce to be bringing in. Through all of this, it's really been a data-based piece. So really understanding what are the numbers saying, what does that affect in terms of our go-to-market and what we're trying to do to ramp up. And that's changing rapidly, and it can, particularly in the US market, for example, very small changes can affect dramatically. So, having a role out there that's $1 an hour less, 50 cents less, can make a huge difference on your attractiveness, particularly when you're looking at the skills in, say, the warehousing side of things, which I know is something that was mentioned earlier going. That kind of small micro data point can make a huge difference, particularly when you've got some of the massive organizations that were ramping up very, very dramatically, the likes of Amazon, that are very aggressive in this space. So really understanding the external market and how it's shifting and how fast it's shifting, and getting that information to decision makers rapidly has been absolutely key through this period.
And has that required a different kind of skill set or focus from your team or your colleagues?
So from my team specifically, it's meant more of a ramp up of our capacity and capabilities. So it's had a huge demand on our team. We've had to redeploy other people into our team. So my team's pretty much doubled in size during this period. We still can't keep up with demand, but there is just too much demand from the business. It's definitely meant that our the HR workforce having to get better at understanding data and how to articulate what that data means for us as a business. We were on that journey anyway, so luckily that isn't a new thing for us, but absolutely it's been called into question, and you're getting much greater focus on the data than ever before.
Can I bring you in, Alex? What have you seen in your experiences in terms of recruitment and HR teams having to make better use of data and insight? Is it something that you've seen ramp up as well? You need to unmute yourself. Actually, everyone should just unmute themselves, because I'm going to put a lot of questions to people.
Yeah, I think we've been working a lot on our data strategy internally for some time now. But yeah, of course, as you see a step change in the market, it's even more important that you understand which industries are starting to recover, which industries are finding it more challenging, and also how you can support people in different ways. And so data and insight really helps you understand the way you can support your customers better, and the way you can support your candidates better. So yeah, absolutely, we're using data all the time to understand how better to be effective as a partner to clients and candidates.
I'm going to take a question that we had sent in advance, and I'll put this to you, Gerwyn. Given the Chancellor's track record, what measures do you expect him to take to mitigate the impact of further job retention measures when the scheme ends? So what do we think will happen post-October? Or what should he be doing? And if you want to offer advice to the government there.
Yeah. I think I've at least partly covered that question. But in terms of the CIPD's position on this, I think it's a question of just either having an active scheme and then simply transferring it onto a passive one, rather than and transferring it onto an active one. I think you can actually have both. And our specific suggestion is that you replace the job retention scheme with a short-time working proposal, which would benefit sectors such as hospitality, who are perhaps quite slow to recover from this, and it would enable them to bring people back on a sort of 3-day or 2-day working week. The idea is that the employers would pay for those 2 or 3 days, and the government would top up the remainder. So I think we think that's a fair way. It provides some stability to those sectors that I think will still be suffering in October, because social distancing, I very much doubt will disappear by then. So we're very lucky at the CIPD with a very grateful support from Adecco to have really good information on this, and we'll have a study going up in the next few weeks to just look at what the future impact will be as the job retention scheme winds down, and what the impact will be from November, which we will be feeding into our government channels.
Thank you. Alex, before we went live this afternoon, you were saying that some organisations are still not comfortable recruiting virtually. Could you expand on that a bit and think how we might be able to get over it? And then Toby, I'm going to come to you to ask how you're actually doing it in practice.
Sure. So I think there are many organisations that have continued hiring virtually and are very comfortable with it as well. Although we are seeing some reticence, and I think as time's gone on and the period has extended further, being in lockdown, people have started to become warmer to the idea. What we're doing is we're building out case studies showing the successes of onboarding and recruiting virtually. But I think some of it is based around them being able to physically onboard the person in the environment. So it's not necessarily all about virtual hiring, it's about whether they can actually physically onboard the person and bring them into the organisation at this time. So I think it's a blend of reasons. But yeah, what we're doing is building out case studies to support showcasing how organisations are doing it effectively, supporting them with hints and tips around how they can do that in a successful way and not lose out on the talent that is available in the market right now, which is really critical, because we have more talent available in the market right now than we have had previously. So if organizations are looking to recruit, then it's the time to make sure that they do it through this period, not necessarily wait where that talent may not be available anymore.
And what have you seen work well?
What have we seen work well?
In terms of virtual hiring, what does good practice look like?
So I think we've used a number of different pieces of technology. I mentioned one earlier that we're using, Odro, for video conferencing. I think that's worked very well. And also I think it's supporting clients through that process, or supporting candidates through that process. So some candidates are more comfortable being interviewed over video than others, and some clients are more comfortable having those conversations with potential recruits over interview. So I think it's about supporting clients and candidates through that process, so that we can make sure that both parties put their best foot forward when they're working in a new and different way. So I think that's worked well. And I think it's also just showcasing and sharing ideas. So bringing clients together from similar industries and from complementary industries to share best practice, and helping them see how we can all learn together through what is a very new time for us all.
Thank you. And Toby, has it worked in practice for you around the hiring, but somebody's asked specifically about how you've managed new starters, as they've had quite a few people that have started or working remotely, and would love to get some ideas to help them settle into the workplace while doing so?
Yeah, I think it's something we've started, but I think, to be honest, we like most firms, we're probably going to go through an evolution. It's going to improve as we go. I think the stage we're at is you just need to over communicate and have that understanding that you need to be much more explicit than ever before. To Alex's point earlier around the whole over communication piece, I think even more so with a new starter. We're very, my team specifically, we're very remote comfortable. My team is split between, I'm in the UK, my team's in the Netherlands and India. Half the team have never met each other. We're all very, very comfortable in that remote environment. So bringing on people remotely for us, it's somewhat of a comfort zone in that we're used to it now. We're used to having whole onboarding schedules where people will be remote. They won't meet anybody face to face. They will have lots of e-learning time or time scheduled to have a lot of that exploration time. You've got to be much more structured, I find, around how you introduce people than ever before. They're not going to have that natural moment where they bump into somebody grabbing a coffee, or they bump into somebody at a lift and they get introduced to people. So you have to be much more deliberate about who you're introducing them to, how you're creating that network and that safety net for them internally. I think more so than ever, the buddy type system has worked very, very well, but they do have a singular point of contact where they can turn to and say, look, I just don't know what it is. Can you help me? Because they don't have that. They don't have the person next to them they can just call upon. I think it does depend on the levels of the individual coming in as well. I think we're still seeing, and this isn't just Philips, but when I talk to my peers, we're still seeing a hesitance around bringing on senior execs on a pure virtual environment. The senior leadership there's still a hesitance there. But I think it's the way forward. People are going to have to get used to it, and people are going to have to get used to operating in this virtual environment. So it's something to be improved. We're definitely on the right path. There's still a long way to go.
And one tip I can share that I'm hearing from a lot of kind of HR directors in my network around onboarding is the need to cut it down into smaller, more manageable blocks. So whereas you might have put somebody on a 8-hour, I mean, that does sound still pretty horrible, all-day course, the need to break that out into more manageable chunks. And I think that's what you're saying, Toby, about being really, really structured about
100%. And being very aware that with particularly for spending a lot of screen time, the energy flow. So you wouldn't want to put a high energy task like meeting somebody for the first time next to another high energy task, because you're just going to burn out the employees. So making sure you're kind of very aware of what they're doing when they're doing it, just so that you can manage that.
Katie, just one suggestion that I heard recently, which I thought was quite good, is that to build on Toby's point about a buddying scheme, is to actually form a group of new recruits because of course the danger and the risk is that it's the daunting enough experience sometimes starting a new role with a new organisation. To do it in your own home can feel quite isolating. So if you pool some of those new entrants together, they can share some of their mutual concerns, and that can offset some of that feeling of isolation and tackle some of those challenges as a collective.
Definitely. Thank you. Labour market specific ones, I'll put it to you first, Gerwin. I appreciate you might not be able to answer. Do you anticipate that the public sector in the UK is also likely to have some mass scale redundancies later in the year or next year? Have you done any research on the public sector?
Well, certainly the early indications are that it's faring well. Of course, ultimately will depend on what the economic policy is in the years ahead, whether the government, whether the government strategy is to raise taxes, cut public spending, or just simply increase debt. Now, the early indications are that it's very much veered towards the latter, that actually they're going to spend their way out of this recession, which suggests that perhaps the public sector will be more protected than they were post 2010, which has been debated as whether that was a good thing or not. And I'm not sure whether the government want to return to that, for political reasons alone. But it strikes me as being a sensible way forward. And the other thing, of course, is that we have this newfound love for NHS workers and the public sector, and as well as low-paid workers. So they seem more protected this time round than certainly they were 10 years ago.
Alex, have you got any data or thoughts on public sector hiring intentions or confidence?
Yeah, no, it's not. We're not seeing any signs that levels are diminishing at this point. So nothing further to be able to add really, other than what we know today.
Thank you. How can HR professionals ensure that they remain relevant in the job market if, as Alex predicted, we get an increase in things like automation and AI? What skills should we acquire so that we don't stay out of the market in future? I'll put that to you first, Toby, as a practitioner.
Yeah, I think there's two, almost on the face of it, very different skills. So one would be the data side of things. Once again, 100%. Put my hands up, I'm very biased. So I think understanding data and getting comfortable with data, you don't have to be a data scientist. You just have to understand what you're looking at, and primarily translate that. What does that mean to the business? There's the old adage of, you go into a senior leadership meeting, everyone's got their Excels and HR have their PowerPoints. We just don't necessarily talk the language of business. So understanding data and understanding what that means is really important. So loads of free resources out there. Adecco.org is a great resource to if you just want to get some official kind of training on data science. I'm sure CIPD do some great stuff as well. So I'd say one side is that data and understanding data and data storytelling. And I think the other really important key skill comes back to what Alex was saying earlier, is around communication. And this environment we're in at the moment, communicating and being that facilitator of communications across the organization it is absolutely vital. So I'd say it's never been a better time to really upskill around how you facilitate communications and that translation piece, because I think that's going to be absolutely vital.
Alex, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think dialing up the communication is critical, particularly when people are working remotely. But anyway, because there's going to just be constant change. And I think people feel more confident and feel stronger in what they're doing if they're communicated with and understand what the next steps are. I also think, I mentioned it at the end of my presentation, resilience to change is going to be absolutely critical, because it is going to continue to change. Things are going to continue to move on every day, and that's tiring for people. And so I think that resilience piece and being able to assess that and that flexibility piece is really important. And creativity, as I mentioned, being able to think through what the future could look like. I think data, as Toby discussed, is really important, but we have to know how that data can be used in order to deliver results. And that's so important. Data for data's sake is no use to anyone. That data has to then be able to be translated into something that can deliver a return. And I think that's really critical, with that creativity to think about how we can reimagine the future.
Go in.
And for me, just to second, data analytics will be particularly key, especially with regard to the need to increase productivity, which will be greater than ever for obvious reasons. So I think HR will come under more pressure especially in relation to underlining the importance of improving that link between productivity and training investment, automation. I think HR will be at the focal point of that, but also in terms of public policy. So the good work agenda is not going away. We've got new initiatives such as gender pay reporting that have been introduced over the recent past, and we can see more of that activity coming further down the line. And lastly, on the migration restrictions point, I think perhaps for those who will be using the immigration system for the first time, which will be many from next year, as well as those who are already using it. So I think HR is underestimating the impact it will have on both the capability and capacity of the teams, given that it will be tasked with administering what is an incredibly complex system to navigate through. And I dare say there will be some legal expertise that we lent upon to help with that, but HR will undoubtedly need some expertise and knowledge itself to ensure this is successful.
Thank you. I'm just going to mention a comment that somebody's put in that really brings home the importance of the over communication, or you can't communicate too much. That they've joined a company in the middle of the pandemic and have realised that actually a once a week check-in isn't enough. That they need to be kind of matched with somebody, and to really get to know the organisation, it requires a lot more check-in time than kind of a once a week, are you okay? I think that really kind of brings it to life. I wanted to ask about the kind of, so different sectors, obviously some sectors are hiring and have high demand, others are pretty much flat. Do you think that we might see kind of more, I guess, agile recruitment models, more kind of use of ecosystems and collaboration between companies and sectors as we kind of move forward into recovery? Toby, have you got any thoughts on that?
100%. So I think that we're already seeing that. So Philips are in agreements with other organisations where we're borrowing staff essentially in certain functions, particularly in the US. Once again, when we're ramping up production, so we're already seeing that at a very small scale. I think it's that the fluidity of the skill set and that agility within the workforce to be able to move skills in and out is absolutely key. And I think that also ties into two things. We often talk about the future work around gig work, and the joy of the gig work is you're having all the variety and the flexibility, etc., etc. But I think one thing that I'm seeing with the COVID situation is people would also like a bit more stability, and often that's associated with larger enterprise organisations. Not always as stable as we think they are. But I think having both worlds, people want their cake and eat it. They want to be able to have the flexibility and the variety, but the stability. So I think having that kind of shared resource model where people can flow in and out of organizations will tick both boxes. And I think that will also tie into Alex's point earlier around investing in learning and development. If you can't invest in core training, let them experience new things in another organization, let them develop that way. So I think for me, it's going to be absolutely key.
Alex, do you think that's a trend we'll see?
Absolutely. We're already talking to a couple of organisations on this point and have already deployed some programmes in Europe and in the US also, where we're seeing people from the aviation industry move into the retail industry, where they can support in e-commerce. So I think understanding where the transferable skills are and being open to those transferable skills and seeing the benefit of moving people from one area to another is really critical. And of course, as you say, there's organizations that are hiring and desperate for staff, and there are organizations that are having challenges right now. So being able to marry that up and understand the transferable skill division and being able to utilize that is the perfect way to benefit both organizations.
Goin, a question for you. Given that it seems likely there'll be a second phase or wave of coronavirus, what key things can employers do now to shore up against further job losses that would have an even greater impact on the labour market? And perhaps you could kind of dig into some of those mitigating things that people have done.
Yes, so I think that the variety of tactics that that employers can adopt. So it starts, of course, with the wage bill. That is the biggest component of costs in any organisation. So it starts with that. And I think the important point to remember here is that we are in this together, and that if there are pay freezes being adopted across the board, then it needs to be across the board, because we are seeing some exceptions to that in organisations, which is not doing much for employee morale and engagement. And then you've got there's been less conversation about the other range of options available to employers, like such as sabbaticals, such as the flexible working arrangements I mentioned. Alex introduced some really interesting data around where specific age cohorts are at in terms of assessing where they are in their career, and I think it's perhaps incumbent on us to give people that space during a period of reflection to assess those options, while perhaps easing some of the pressure of the wage bill. And then of course you've got the recruitment freezes, you've got the marginal labour sort of around agency worker contracts and stuff like that, that could be shaved. The variety of the things that some employers can look at.
Yeah. I'm just going to ask one more question and then we'll have to bring it to a close. Somebody's asked, what technical or functional skills do you anticipate seeing as growth areas post-COVID to support the new business landscape? So that could be things that already exist or potentially new things that become more important. Alex, any thoughts? I'm kind of sorry, asking you to predict the future there.
Apologies. My husband was just asking me something. This is the traditional situation. My husband asked me something while I'm trying to do something. Somebody was at the door. So apologies. Could you just repeat the question?
Sure, of course. What technical or functional skills, it's the new normal. What technical or functional skills do you anticipate seeing as growth areas post-COVID to support the new business landscape? So that could be existing skills that are getting more important or potentially new roles.
Yeah, so I think I touched on a couple, and I think we've seen a few different skills areas start to become more important. And I think there's quite a bit around transformation, a lot around machine learning, and we're starting to see incremental slight increases in varying different technical skills, and lots in data analytics, data science, as we've discussed earlier. But I think sort of in day-to-day, just generally getting colleagues much more comfortable with using different technologies. I think we were using as an organisation Microsoft Teams quite effectively as an organisation. However, all of a sudden the learning has gone up hugely in the last few weeks, as you can imagine, and now people are finding new ways and new functionalities that they just didn't know existed before, and we have moved exponentially so far up the curve in terms of using all that functionality that previously would have taken us a long time to get to grips with, or to get people using it in a different way. So I think just people becoming more comfortable with technology is making them more hungry to learn, and also I think that is also, as I mentioned earlier, making people want to actually do more personal home learning and to really develop themselves throughout this period. And it's given people an appetite for it, which I think is really positive.
Thank you. And Toby, any thoughts from you on that one?
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned earlier, but I think I keep harking back to the communication piece that Alex raised, but I think that's going to be absolutely key. So that sort of functional skill and the skills around how do you effectively communicate, how do you bring teams together to disband, because we're seeing a lot more of this kind of fluid, agile working where you're not set within your structured silo anymore. So really understanding how to bring teams and communicate and have that transparency across is going to be absolutely key. I think there's an opportunity for HR overall at the moment. We've often said, how do we get the seat at the table? But for me, the seat's always been there. It's just whether we want to take it up or not. And I think we're really in a time where the human element of the organisation is very much under the microscope. And it's up to us really to decide which direction that goes in. Do things get massively automated? Do we have huge digital transformation? Do functions look at it and go, well, actually, this is the chance to offshore or outsource? And suddenly we're in a very tough situation to try and dig back from? Or do we take the step up and say, well, actually, look, let's try and lead this from the front and be proactive on this one, and get involved with real estate, get involved with your strategy teams, get involved with M&A, get involved with your go-to-market strategies, etc., and actually drive the conversation. And I think for that, you need some really good business partnering skills, some very good commercial awareness, and you have to understand not just how the business functions and works together, but actually how it operates and how it delivers what it needs to deliver. And I think that's where a big skill set could come from, is that true business partnering.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop it there. I think that's a really nice point to finish, because I think we've all been banging on quite a lot about what opportunity this is for the profession to really step up and be adding value, because as we know, it's all about people, and I think never more so than at this moment. But thank you so much, everyone, for watching and for your questions. I'd like to thank our panel. A reminder that the webinar and the slides will be available on demand from this afternoon. And a final reminder about our new wellbeing helpline for members in the UK and Ireland. And you can see details about that and how you access it on your screen now. As I said earlier, we're not doing any webinars next week. Instead, we'll be running numerous online sessions as part of the CIPD Festival of Work, and we hope to see many of you virtually there. We'll be back on the 17th of June with a webinar about evidence-based HR with Professor Rob Breener. But for now, that's it from us. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.